Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors Legal Hotline lawyer. In today's market, buyers tend to want to make offers without a financing contingency. Makes their offer more competitive in a competitive market scenario. And on its face, that seems like a really great outcome for the seller, because now the seller has a transaction where the buyer doesn't have the benefit of a financing contingency. But as an industry, we kind of need to pull the curtain back on that and see what's going on behind the scenes from both the buyer's and the seller's perspective in the absence of a financing contingency, because it really is a significant shift, and it's not an industry norm historically in the real estate industry. So what's really going on in a transaction where buyer has no financing contingency? Well, of course, it depends on the transaction itself. Maybe we have a scenario where buyer has adequate cash resources to purchase the property, and in fact is going to use their cash resources to purchase the property, and that's easy, no problem. But let's say we have a buyer who has adequate cash resources to purchase the property, but prefers not to use buyer's cash, and instead wants to get a loan to fund the transaction. Is it okay in that scenario? Buyer's going to go get a loan. They don't have to, but they're going to go get a loan. Is it okay for that buyer to not include a financing contingency in the purchase and sale agreement? Of course. But that buyer still has to have an appraisal of the property, and buyer has no right to bring an appraiser through seller's property unless buyer has seller's permission to bring an appraiser through seller's property. So buyer is going to have to either include a low appraisal provision, the contingency for a low appraisal, which is Form 22AA, or buyer broker, you're going to have to write a provision on a Form 34 or some other blank space by which seller agrees to give buyer permission to bring an appraiser through seller's house. Either way, I mean, in one respect you have a contingency for low appraisal by not including 22AA and simply writing a provision that gives permission to bring the appraiser through. There's no contingency associated with that. It's just a granting of permission. Okay, let's look at the next type of buyer. We have a buyer who doesn't include a financing contingency and intends to go get a loan, not because they want to, but because they have to. Buyer's not going to be able to close this transaction unless buyer succeeds in getting financing. Is there anything wrong with that buyer not including a financing contingency in the agreement? The answer is no. There's nothing wrong with that, so long as buyer includes an evidence of funds addendum, Form 22EF, in their offer, and the request for permission from seller to have the appraisal. Now, why the 22EF? The 22EF is a disclosure to seller of the fact that buyer is relying on a contingent source of funds. So buyer would use Form 22EF, go down to paragraph 3, and identify that buyer is relying on a contingent source of funds, financing for whatever percentage of the amount of the transaction buyer is relying on the financing for. And with that disclosure, buyer will satisfy the requirement set forth in Form 21, the purchase and sale agreement, paragraph A, which says that buyer is not relying on a contingent source of funds unless otherwise disclosed. So the Form 22EF constitutes that disclosure of buyer's reliance on a contingent source of funds without creating a contingency that benefits buyer in the event buyer can't get the financing. In other words, buyer is saying to seller, hey, look, seller, I do have to go get a loan, but I am going to bear the entire risk of whether or not I can get the loan. I don't need you to shoulder the liability of whether or not I'm going to get financing. I'm confident enough in my own financing ability that I'm going to bear the risk of whether or not I can get financing. So I'm not looking for a financing contingency. I'm just putting you on notice that I have to go get financing. But if I fail in my efforts to get financing, then seller, I'm in breach. And if buyer and seller have agreed to the forfeiture of earnest money provision on the face of the purchase and sale agreement, then seller's entire remedy from buyer's breach will be the forfeiture of the earnest money, because buyer disclosed the fact that they were relying on a contingent source of funds. even though they don't have the financing contingency. All right, let's look at one more aspect of this question, or this behind the curtain review of what's really happening. Let's look at this from the seller's perspective. Because the easy answer is to say, oh, hip hip hooray, seller has, or buyer has no financing contingency, which means that if buyer can't close a transaction, seller's going to get the earnest money. Yay! But there is a cost to seller of having no financing contingency. And here's the cost. Seller has no right and no ability to know what is happening in buyer's lending effort or efforts to get the loan. If buyer has a financing contingency, Form 22A, then seller has the benefit of both paragraphs 2 and 3 in the financing addendum. Paragraph 2 says that seller has the right to know what's happening in buyer's loan effort. Buyer, what documents have you already given to your lender? Who is your lender? I get permission to talk to them. With Form 22A, the financing contingency in the transaction, and seller taking advantage of the loan information provision, seller will not ever be surprised at the closing table that buyer wasn't able to get their loan. Imagine the scenario where buyer has no financing contingency but is dependent upon getting a loan in order to close the transaction. Now, if buyer doesn't get the loan and doesn't close the transaction, buyer's in breach and seller gets the earnest money. Let's say we have a $2,000 earnest money. And let's say also that buyer learned 15, 20 days into the transaction that buyer was not going to be qualified for the loan that buyer thought buyer was going to get to close the transaction. Buyer has a 45-day closing period, so for the next 30 days, seller's house is off the market. Seller has no idea that this transaction is going south. Buyer is doing everything they can to try and come up with loan funds. They're buying a lottery ticket every single week, right? But at the end of their 45-day period, they don't have the loan funds, and seller learns for the very first time that they've been spinning their wheels for the last 30 days when they could have terminated the transaction based on Form 22A, paragraph 3, had they known then that buyer already was not qualified for financing. But seller lost the ability to do that because seller lost the right or the basis for having information about buyer's loan efforts. The point of this communication is not that listing brokers should put a financing contingency into the transaction. It's certainly not that. But the point of this communication is this: every transaction is different. And listing brokers, buyer brokers, you both have to understand what the significance is to your client of not having a financing contingency in the transaction. It may not be in your client's best interest to eliminate the financing contingency, whether you represent the buyer or the seller. But you have to understand the essence of the transaction enough to be able to evaluate that question. If you have questions on how to do that, or you want to talk more about this topic or any other, please send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.